It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID live stream, Series 8, Episode 4, that amounts to episode number 46, starts here. Lots of exciting news this week in Exchange Invest Daily. You've got to be joining us every day by the newsletter in order to understand what's going on in the world of exchanges. But of course, one of the important stories of recent times has been COP26. The overall environmental side of the financial markets has been exploding after what we can see in terms of, well, this theme for today, the market view from COP26 with our guest, Steve Zwick. Steve's a former futures broker and trader in Chicago. Nowadays, Steve writes about the economics of sustainable development and the interplay between land use and climate change, two subjects he developed a fascination for during a 30-year career that brought him from Chicago's trading pits and led all the way to subsistence farms in rural parts of Kenya, Vietnam, and Brazil. As a journalist, Steve has worked for publications as diverse as the Chicago Reader, Fortune, and Time magazines. He's been twice shortlisted for the World Leadership Forum's prestigious Business Journalist of the Year award and produced radio features for Germany's Deutsche Welle radio, where indeed at one stage he was presenting, I do believe, a breakfast news show, and National Public Radio in the United States of America. Steve, good evening and welcome. Where in the world are you today?
I'm in Rotterdam right now, Rotterdam, Netherlands.
Wow. And how's lockdown going for you there?
It's going fine. You know, we don't go out that much, but no, it's fine. If you can go out to as many restaurants as you want, as long as you have your proof of vaccination and get out of there by 7 o'clock. So it's fine.
So therefore, it's great if you want to have an early evening. It's ideal.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting. I wasn't aware of the fact that pathogens travel faster in the dark
after
I don't 7 p.m.
Yeah, I don't get the logic of that either. They shuffle you out. I guess people get drunk, they get closer, they get more huggy and stuff like that. The Dutch are warm, fuzzy people.
Well, it's fascinating. It's great to see you all together today. Thank you very much for joining us. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've got a question for Steve about the exciting world of environmental finance and carbon finance, ping us a message wherever you're watching this, Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and we'll be delighted to pass on your question to Steve. Hello, Simon Huckle. Thanks for joining us this evening amongst many other viewers. It's great to see you amongst our loyal cadre. So we're on the market view from COP26. Hold on a second. COP26, Steve. I mean, people, I think, have forgotten pretty much the better part of at least 15 to 20 of the previous 25 episodes. Can you try and take us back a little bit to get us, where was the nascence of carbon trading, environmental finance?
Yeah, I can go back before the first COP. You go back to the 1970s when scientists first started to realize that that climate change was a looming issue, and and I focus on nature-based solutions. So there was a paper that was written in the mid-70s, called "Can Trees Get Us Out of?" It was, I forget the name of the paper. It was written by Freeman Dyson, well-known physicist who's still with us. And he basically said, if climate change becomes a real serious issue, can we plant a bunch of trees to get us out of the mess? And he concluded that if you can plant a bunch of trees to buy some time until you do the industrial reduction. So that really became the genesis of carbon offsetting. And then by the end of the 70s, you had the World Climate Conference in Switzerland, which is where they really reached a global consensus on the fact that climate change was a threat that would probably have an impact by the end of the century, and that bad management of forest farms and fields was a key driver. So that goes back a long way. By 1992, though, that was the first time that we had the big global climate summit. That was in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And then they decided they created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is an annual event where the leaders of the world get together and they sit down and they decide what is going to be what's going to be the course for the next year. Over the course of the year, you have lots of other meetings going on, technical meetings and stuff like that. But the COP is the big one that comes at the end of the year. And by the time the COP comes around, there's been negotiations happening. Usually anything that's going to happen has already been mapped out ahead of the COP. You rarely see breakthroughs at the COP. If you do see a breakthrough, it's because the negotiators have they have their marching orders, and they have very narrow bands within which they can operate by the time they get there. But that's in a nutshell. That's what the COP is, and carbon trading goes back. The idea, if you look at the Kyoto Protocol, that was when, I mean, it really goes back to the U.S. If you look at NOx and SOx, nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxides in acid rain in the early 1990s, there was a pretty successful program to reduce emissions by putting a cap on overall emissions and letting companies that achieved lower reductions sell their allowances to other companies. So building on that success, when the Kyoto Protocol came along, they created something called the Clean Development Mechanism, which is a way for countries, emitting companies in the developed world, in Europe and the United States, had mandatory caps. The developing world didn't, because they really didn't have, they weren't responsible for the emissions up to that point. So the Clean Development Mechanism made it possible for companies in, say, Germany to offset their emissions by financing a clean development program, like a renewable energy project, a wind farm, solar field, or something like that in China or in India. And they could then use that use that purchase towards meeting their commitments within the European Union, within the European Union's cap and trade program. Did I explain that right? Or ask questions if there's anything fuzzy.
Well, let's take it back a step. So we started with Freeman Dyson, and he had this amazing paper, Can We Control the Carbon Dioxide in the Atmosphere?
That's
and the answer, I think, was a tentative yes, we can, without any Obamayan legacy they're in or they're not in. But he was basically outlining those things. So you talk about NOx and SOx and acid rain that we get through, and those are all things that were actually hugely popular in the 1990s, but do seem to have kind of died out in a remarkable degree. And it's quite incredible what goes on. So therefore, I suppose the thing I would say is instantly, does that mean that market solutions really can help what's going on here?
I think they can. I mean, some people would say they can't, but I think it's pretty clear that they can. If I think the problem is we haven't. If you look at California, they've managed to reduce their emissions by putting a cap on emissions within the state, letting people trade out of it. If you compare California to the Northeast, I think you also have a nice contrast, because the Northeast was so obsessed with not having too high a price that they would release allowances in when prices got too high, and California didn't do that, so they're able to have a more of a driver. But ultimately, there's two different approaches to what carbon markets can do, and I think that's also an important distinction, because there's this. If you look at what Nordhaus wrote about back, he also, I should have mentioned him when I'm mentioning Dyson, because he came up with the idea of proposed carbon markets also back in the 70s and 80s. But if his idea was, if you had a high carbon price, that would force companies to make the kind of changes that they have to make to reduce emissions. And there's a countervailing theory that is carbon offsets can help drive reductions at the most cost-effective mitigation outcomes. So if you're going to offset, if you're in a sector that's very hard to abate, and you want to offset your emissions by financing, say, renewable energy in another country, or in the areas that I focus on, by saving endangered forest or financing afforestation, reforestation, that's a way of putting money into low cost, cost-effective ways of reducing emissions overall, while a high carbon price forces companies to make their own internal reductions. And you can have both. You can have a high compliance price covering a certain percentage of emissions, and then you can say, if you want to go above and beyond this, you go into the voluntary markets, and there the focus is more on low cost abatement.
Very interesting. So you're talking there about, I think it was William Nordhaus, and he was the man who was originally talking about carbon pricing really away 30, 40 years ago as well.
Yeah.
No. So you talk about these markets. I mean, there are multiple, it seems to me, variations on a theme of how these things go. And let me just say, by the way, good evening, Simon Huckle. Thank you very much for your comment. It's a joy to see you as usual. Very well, thank you very much. We're enjoying, well, propagating a little bit of hot air here, but we're hoping to save the climate rather than doing it any endangered harm during the course of the next hour with my guest, Steve Zwick, giving us the market view from COP26. If you've got a question for Steve, ping it on over to me. We'll be delighted to use it during the show. So, Steve, you talk about the multiplicity of markets. I've got to say, I've been around the derivatives business as long as you have. We've been in all sorts of markets, all sorts of things. But the way the environmental markets, the way just the carbon market alone is put together, it really is, it's remarkably similar, but entirely different, I think is the only way I can summarize it easily.
Yeah. It's because the compliance price varies by regime. So the price of EU ETAs, European Union emission trading allowances, is a lot higher than the price in California, which is a lot higher than the price in RGGI, which is the northeast part of the U.S. So, and those are three compliance markets. And compliance markets means you're buying an offset in order to meet a regulatory requirement. And or an allowance. I mean, the thing is, you have to differentiate too between allowances and offsets. An allowance is issued by a government that says this is what you're allowed to emit based on different criteria and different regimes. It could be BTUs, it could be anything, and then you could also have a certain percentage of that being an offset. And the compliance price, because it's kind of the driver is commoditized. You can deliver that to meet your compliance obligation no matter where you're at. That price is uniform within each jurisdiction, whereas a voluntary market is a whole different thing. Voluntary is when you're doing something above and beyond what's required by law, often by going into things that are maybe untested or new. So if you look at the voluntary markets, you have markets that are mature, tested, that have been evolving for 45 years, like RED Plus, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. That's where you're essentially paying for conservation, and the carbon credits are generated based on a very complicated sequence of tests that you have to run to show what is the cost of doing nothing and what can you prevent. That's a fairly mature market, and so that there is a convergence around prices, but then you could also have something like what's happened, some of the newer markets like kelp farming, where people are going in and growing big algae blooms or big kelp farms and then sinking them down into the bottom of the sea, where they will sink into, in theory, they'll sink into the bottom of the ocean and become part of the seafloor and never come back up again. So that's a carbon capture and storage way of approach. It's kind of an organic way. And then you have industrial carbon capture and storage, where you have these machines like ClimateWorks, and I think they're in Switzerland, where they just suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and inject it into the ground. The cost on that is like $400 a ton, $300. I've seen varying prices. If I understand correctly, in the U.S., with all with energy subsidies, they can get it down to about $120 a ton. Don't quote me on that, but so you can go from $120 a ton on that down to like right now, RED Plus is about $10 a ton. It was $5 a ton just a year ago. And then you also have a lot of renewable energy projects, which are super cheap now, for an interesting reason. When the renewable energy projects were coming along a while back, there was an argument to be made that they needed that money to build these projects. As the technology changed and renewable energy has now become more mature, you no longer need that finance to pay for those. So they're kind of out of favor. They're kind of, if you're a company and you're buying you buy a voluntary offset, you're doing it to get a corporate claim. You're doing it to sort of show that you did something. And if you buy a renewable energy credit that people are arguing no one really needs anymore, it doesn't, the market doesn't need it to achieve anything. that's kind of it's not going to really give you the cachet in the market that you need. So those are super cheap, and they're not even going to be recognized under a lot of the carbon standards pretty soon.
So that's fascinating. So you outline a picture of regionalism, subsidy is there, which, let's face it, is something we know about in a lot of other markets. I mean, one of the reasons why, for example, rice futures are not more successful is simply because there's actually so much subsidy goes into rice, particularly in Southeast Asia, that it's one of those old-fashioned Panama Cacensis bread and games kind of pieces of politics where everybody's very concerned about the cost of the rice husk. That leads to obviously a lot of confusion, I think, in terms of how people are viewing what goes on with the whole business of pricing. And then you say, there's the voluntary market, and then there's essentially these markets where they're giving allowances. And then you've got the markets. Now, the EU, for example, the EU's auctions, they're auctioning allowances, right?
Yep. They're auctioning allowances, and I think there used to be offsetting in there under the CDM. They used to allow CDM in, and I should know this. I don't know if they do. I've been focusing so much on the voluntary market. I don't know if there's any kind of CDM type stuff in there, but there could, going forward there, with Article 6, that's a definite possibility. And I didn't mention what Article 6 was.
That's an obvious question. What is Article 6, Steve? Tell all.
Article 6 is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And, when this was, it was when the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. And Article 6 is the part dealing with international carbon. Technically, it deals with international cooperation towards reducing emissions. And it has 3 components, 2 of which are market-based, 1 is non-market-based. And because the idea is that if you markets are a way of cooperating. If you're a German company, Daimler-Benz, and you can help a company like Namibia reduce its emissions by financing land use there, you have you have cooperation towards a reduction. And Article 6 was passed. The article itself was enshrined in the Paris Agreement, but the rule book was delayed until just this year in Glasgow. When they passed the Paris Agreement, it had 29 articles, and then each article had to have rules for implementation. And this is this goes back. It was, again, decades of rulemaking. So by the time the Paris Agreement came along, every article sat on top of hundreds of agreements. So most of the articles were written. But when we got into Katowice, where we were supposed to finalize the rule book for all of the articles, Article 6 became a real sticking point, mostly because of the complexity of international transfer. They call them internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. ITMOs is the word. So, and it goes to this dichotomy, or this distinction that I drew earlier between voluntary markets and compliance markets. If you're a if a company in say Germany wants to purchase an international offset in order to meet its compliance requirements in Germany, then and it wants to buy it from, I'll stick with Namibia. The only way they can buy an offset from Namibia to meet their compliance requirement in Germany is to have a corresponding adjustment, meaning Namibia will the government of Namibia has to keep a carbon accounting. They have a carbon inventory, and they have to say, okay, we are going to allow this mitigation outcome to transfer to Germany. This means that even though we within Namibia have reduced our emissions by, say, 10 million tons, whatever. I mean, it's a lot more than that. But if whatever we've reduced it by, we then deduct that emission reduction from what we transfer. So we then add those emissions back to our inventory. We no longer have credit for this. So when it comes to the year-end climate talks, we can't stand up there and say we reduced our emissions this much. That's gone. Germany can say we reduced our emissions that much. That's a corresponding adjustment. And the question is, when do you apply them? When do you not? There's a couple. There's the complexity came in because there's two different market regimes within Article 6. There's Article 6.2 and 6.4. 6.2 is bilateral trades between countries. So that's the one I just described, Germany and Namibia. 6.4 is the successor to the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. The CDM was a centralized market. It was a bottom-up creation, and they set the rules and the standards and everything else. And under 6.4, the UN will also create a centralized hub for trading if countries want to use it. And there could be smaller countries might not have the capacity to develop their own markets. On 6.2, countries can create their own rules. There's meta rules that they have to follow, but they can create a lot of their own rules for dealing bilaterally with each other. 6.4, you're going to have UN-based rules that anybody who wants to go through the hub has to follow. And this issue of corresponding adjustments was a really sticky issue within 6.4 for a couple of reasons. One was you had a lot of these old CDM offsets still kicking around, a lot of older ones, some of which are questionable because they were in that early phase where there was a lot of pilot stuff going on. And remember earlier I mentioned India, Brazil, China. That wasn't just hypothetical. Those were the countries, and South Korea, they produced the most CDM offsets. So these countries had already produced a lot of offsets, and they had these things sitting there. And it's like, they're just going to disappear, or can we use them in the next regime? So that was a big part of it. And then also Brazil wanted a grace period for doing corresponding adjustments, which is a little bit shaky because, that kind of defeats the whole purpose. There's a third complicating element, which is other markets like CORSIA, which is international flights. What happens to those? You pay into that. It doesn't go from one country to another. It goes from one country into the airline industry, which is considered. It's not part of, and shipping too. It goes into sectors that are international, not cross border. So that was one of the complexities. And then there was another. I forget what I had already mentioned and what I didn't. So let me see. What was corresponding. Oh yeah, the third was, we mentioned voluntary markets. What happens on voluntary markets? If I'm a company, again going back to my example before, if I'm a German company and I want to buy an offset from a land project or a reforestation project in Namibia, does Namibia have to do a corresponding adjustment if I'm a German company buying it? Not necessarily, because if I'm a German company and I'm only using it for a voluntary statement that doesn't impact my national accounting, would that be counted? Did I explain that right, or I can't hear you
At this point in
Okay.
time.
Okay.
Hashtag it's complicated at this point in time. That's where I am. So if I understood this correctly, if Germany did their trades the right way with Namibia, at some point in time, everybody in Namibia would be back in the mud huts, and essentially Germany would have greened the whole country, including the desert, because they had all their offsets against them. Is that a plausible outcome?
If it was a compliance credit, and that's one reason you haven't seen that many trades. Companies aren't really using international carbon offsets, for compliance purposes right now. There doesn't seem to be a lot of demand, and there was a fear that the same thing would happen with the voluntary market, because again, if in the voluntary market, if I'm Daimler-Benz and I want to go beyond what the German government is requiring, if I want to do that by financing mitigation projects in Namibia, I can do that. And under Article 6 now, under the rule book, Namibia doesn't have to make a corresponding. They can require a corresponding adjustment, and there's reasons they might want to do that. But generally speaking, they don't have to require it. And what happens is that the question is, what can Daimler Chrysler claim? Can they say they're carbon neutral? That's what they've been saying up until now, is that they were carbon neutral. Now it's like maybe they can't say that. Maybe there's going to be a change on what they can claim, and it would be something along the lines of, we reduced our footprint or our impact by helping Namibia reduce its emission reductions. There's a whole other group going on about that's focused on what kind of claims can we make. That's under these various task forces that exist.
Okay, so we got a cornucopia of task forces, and I do believe actually you have been or are on one of the major task forces as well.
Yeah, I was on the scaling voluntary market. Voluntary market. I forget what it's called. The task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets, and that was the first one. That's no longer. It's not around anymore. It served its purpose and it moved on. And the goal there was there was an awareness. This was convened by Mark Carney, and there was an awareness that we needed to dramatically scale up voluntary carbon markets about 15-fold if they're going to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and they needed to have everybody on the same page. You had various carbon standards that had evolved over the years, and I'd say they were pretty much on the same page. But you had banks coming in, you had companies making claims, there was a big fear that it was just going to run away from everyone if we didn't get everyone together. So through a period process that lasted about a year or so, they really had a big tent, and I think we reached agreement on a lot of key issues, and issues that couldn't be reached were passed on. They created new task force, and one of them is the Voluntary Markets Integrity Group, I think is what they just changed the name of it, but that is the one that's focused on what kind of claims can you make. And there are governance bodies and stuff that are designed to kind of create to create regimes, have governance bodies comprised of standards and regional regulators, and then you have it's a lot like the futures associations. You have self-regulating entities working together with regulatory bodies to create some kind of global standards. But the big one going forward is going to be more there, because there's the market integrity, which is, can you say that the reductions that are being claimed are really there? And I think that's a question of just making sure the standards are doing their job, making sure that the verifiers are independent, a lot of issues that have always been around. And then the other one is, can you say that what kind of corporate claims are being made? And that's going to be tricky because, you don't want to have companies thinking they can just go out, buy a bunch of offsets and say, we don't have to reduce. And they're like, at what point can a company say they're carbon neutral?
Okay, so there's a huge amount to be done, but it's a very, very fast moving market, and it's still in an elementary state. One of those things which I think is interesting is actually, we've got a question from Woman on It to go down to the micro level at the start. Good evening, Steve. Hello, Woman on It. It's lovely to see you as well. Good evening, Steve. What is your suggestion for a small company that wants to make a sensible and impactful climate pledge?
Yeah, it all depends on the company. I think for all companies, the same thing applies, which is first, reduce, look to where you can reduce your emissions, and what you can't reduce, you look to offset. And when you look to offset, make sure you're offsetting with a credible program. So depending on the industry you're in, so yeah, it really depends really on what sector you're in. But if you can find ways to eliminate immediately, do it. And then I'd say, try to come up what you can't eliminate immediately, set time-bound targets, especially, let your customers know. That's very important that we plan to be at net zero. That's actually something too I should point out. You try to decide if you want to be carbon neutral or net zero. The difference is subtle. Net zero is where we all have to be, and by 2050 or so. And net zero means you've eliminated all of the what they call absolute emissions that you possibly can. You switch to renewable energy. Whatever your sector is in. If you're a farmer, you're growing your own fuel. You're using switch crops and cover crops. There's all these different things that anybody can do. You're doing all of that. Now you're only offsetting the remainder, and you're only offsetting with removals. There's two different kinds of offsets. It does get complicated. Reductions and removals. And that's a big debate too, because by the end state, when we're at net zero, we have to be, the only offsets really that are viable are removals, because at that point we've theoretically achieved all the reductions we can. In the short term, though, it doesn't matter. If we don't reduce, we're going to have to pull it back down anyway. So think about what you want to do in terms of an offset strategy too. You have to have an internal reduction strategy. You need an offset strategy. Try to see if it aligns with your business. If you're in agriculture, look at land-based offsets. If your company has a lot of industrial emissions, look at I'm a big fan of land nature-based solutions, because they're so important. They have so many co-benefits, and there's something we can do now. But some would argue that if you're in the industrial sector, you should offset your emissions with industrial offsets. If your business is lucrative enough, or if your reductions are low enough, look into really high-end offsets like carbon capture and storage, but be prepared to pay for it.
Fascinating. So actually already we got woman on it saying, thank you, Steve. Always great to hear a sensible and coherent approach. Never heard or understood the net zero concept. I think you've explained that very, very neatly. Now, we got another question came in from a LinkedIn user. We can't see their username. It seems there's a cornucopia of prices for carbon. Can we reach a single world benchmark, Steve?
That's the big debate right now. That's one of the goals of the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets was to first achieve what they were calling a core carbon principles, and then based on that, find a market-based approach to delivering a global reference, a global benchmark for voluntary carbon. And it's theoretically possible, but it's really, really hard to do because they're so different. I mean, I sat around on calls with people a lot better educated on this, and on economics than I am, and nobody agreed on this. I think the thing is, if you look at a tree planting project, or a Red Plus project, and you look at all the co-benefits, and you look at the costs. I mean, because that's the thing too. The cost of reducing emissions can be pretty high in certain cases, and a lot of times there's the co-benefits are really high too. By co-benefits, I mean, let's say you have an indigenous tribe that is using carbon markets to keep out illegal loggers. That's a Red Plus project. They're also giving women an opportunity to develop their livelihoods. They're providing income for their people. They're developing lots of alternative income strategies. The co-benefits on that are so high, and they're so intertwined with the carbon benefit. How can you link that out? And there's this theory out there that if we could find a core carbon price, make it a market driven one, then you can have something like the commodity markets, where you have a core price, and then you have here's a core carbon price. Now, they do biodiversity too. We add that on, and they're improving the water quality. We can add that on too, and add these in. In theory, it sounds great, but I just don't. I vacillate on that every day. There is a group. I've got this little token here that was given to me at Glasgow, and this is one of the exchanges is creating a tokenized. They're creating a basket of commodity of different. They're taking a basket of different offset prices and creating a single price with a weighted average. So, and then you can buy this token that is a volunteer that symbolizes 1 ton of emission reduction. There's another exchange, CPL, is taking a different approach. What they're doing is they're taking different types of offsets, and then they're also creating a basket, but instead of creating like tokenizing it, they're saying that the lowest available offset is the lowest deliverable, is the one that you can use. But that takes in both of these, it takes the individuality out of these. When people are buying offsets from land use and from charismatic projects, the story is so important. They want to know who the people are, And because every one of these tribal projects has such an amazing story. I mean, if I get started on this, we'll run out of time pretty quick. They're pretty amazing.
Well, that sounds like a great topic to move on to later. I mean, air carbon exchange, that's really interesting because, in fact, we're going to be coming back and meeting with Air Carbon Exchange in January, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to have an IPO-VID devoted to that. Now, one of the things that's gone on in the last week, Stephen, maybe you can help me here because I really am a bit of a carbon derivatives idiot or a bit of a carbon auction idiot, is the Intercontinental Exchange. They made this huge announcement last week. They're going to host carbon credit auctions for Permian Global. Permian Global are a leading developer of large-scale tropical forest protection restoration projects. Now, what they said in the thing was, we're going to take a leap forward for the first time into having a global carbon price. So I got very excited about that in Exchange Invest. And I said, well, this is absolutely wonderful. It's incredible. No sooner did I do that than the good folks of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, on behalf of expansive CBL, who they have a shareholding in, were saying, well, I think it's important to call you out because you're wrong, Patrick. Now, I'm quite happy to admit I'm wrong at well, various points in time. I'm wrong, given the fact I produce 250 newsletters a year and do goodness knows how many trades and investments. I mean, I'm wrong quite frequently, actually. So I'm curious. Walk me through this. Not a question of am I right or am I wrong. What are the similarities? What are the differences in terms of what the Permian Global Auction brings to the Intercontinental Exchange and their plans? What is the CME already doing with Expansive? Are they the same? Are they different? How similar are they?
Well, it's, you know, I know Permian very, very well, and I know CME very well, but I don't know. I haven't looked at that deal exactly, so I saw it. It kind of passed by, and there was so much going on. It was a busy news week, so I can kind of comment on it a bit. I think what they're doing, but I want to point out first of all that I spent 15 years as managing editor of Ecosystem Marketplace, and we had the first global carbon price. I think think anybody would agree with that. And CBL always told us that our price was wrong, but they weren't the first. But CBL is one of the ones that I mentioned. What CBL is offering is the geo, they call it, and then they have the NGO, and they're both the similar concept, was that they take a global basket. The geo is a basket of offsets that meet the requirements for CORSIA, which is the international aviation sector, and the thing is, CBL is a platform, trading platform, so anybody can go and list on their platform. I don't know if anybody, but projects, you can list your project there, and sell your offsets that way. And for years their price, according to project developers, was they were kind of a dumping ground because they don't want to hear this, but they've always disputed this. I'll point out, but what I heard from project developers was they would, most of these were negotiated bilaterally. You would have a big deal, you'd sell a bunch of offsets to Delta or some big airline, you'd have some remnants, and you'd put them on CBL. What's happened in the last few years is CBL has become much more of an indicative market. So companies are putting their offsets on there first. I talked to, on one of my episodes of my podcast, I talked to a guy named Gabriel Eickhoff, who talked about this about three months ago. He was trying to fill a big order for a client, and he called his usual people, and none of them had supply. He went on CBL and was able to fill it pretty quickly. So they do have a liquid market, and what they do for their global price is they define criteria. They say, here is the lowest deliverable price for this basket of offsets. And what we did at Ecosystem Marketplace, we were more of a call around market. We would just call people up and say, what are the prices? So we never had a market driven approach. And again, I don't know what Permian is doing with ICE or with CME. With ICE, yeah, they're with ICE. I saw that announcement.
Okay, so we got this very interesting series of questions. The good news is that coming in the middle of January, we're going to be talking to Gordon Bennett of the Intercontinental Exchange. And Steve, we're going to get a chance to answer all those questions and get through exactly what's going on. So what I hear from you is that perhaps ICE aren't the first people, certainly they aren't the first people to conceive of a global market. Other people have had a global market of some sort previously, or at least a single price for carbon. But there's a degree of complication between the fact that the CME have certainly managed to get expansive to a point where they're doing a great deal of business. Well, that one's going to run and run. The invitation is out there to CME Expansive as well. They haven't responded yet as to whether they're going to be back. ICER already have thrown their hat into the fray to continue this discussion in January. So let's move on to a question, if we may. We're here today discussing, ladies and gentlemen, the market view from COP26 with climate expert Steve Zwick. He's an expert in carbon markets. So Beate Young, fresh from her visit to the lovely coastal town of Portorož in Slovenia last week for the SME Assembly, after an interesting series of insights by Professor, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, I'm sorry, Professor Luška Kalfeš-Bogataj, a Slovenian climatologist who gave a keynote speech at the SME Assembly, which was much reported last week. Would you agree with the thesis that we should scale up investments in low energy by a factor of 500%, not 10%, not 20 years, in order to mitigate the negative impact of climate?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about the economics of energy, but, I think that's kind of a consensus, is that we need to, ratchet up our investments in renewable energy, is the term I would use, but also energy efficiency, I guess, might be what they're talking about. But I think, we need to, and that's actually one argument for voluntary carbon markets too, is that a lot of times the new technologies are really expensive when they start, and if you can't get a subsidy, using offsets to provide a kind of de facto subsidy or a way to go about it. So I'd say, yeah, that's not quite my, I report these kind of numbers. I don't analyze them, but it makes perfect sense to me, and it's in line with what other people are saying.
Fold investment jump in the very near future. Now we've got another really interesting question. We're jumping around here, Steve, giving you quite the runaround. One could almost see the idea that it might be me being vindictive for all those dodgy questions you asked me on Deutsche Welle radio years ago. So we've got a fascinating input from Colin Howard, our old friend to this show, and early guest on IPO-VID. Hey, Colin, good evening. It's lovely to see you this evening. If airlines paid bottom dredging and scallop fishermen to stop releasing carbon from the seabed, they'd offset the entire CO2 from flying. What are the chances of that happening, Steve? That's a slight geopolitical one for you thrown in there.
Yeah, that's I don't know enough about the economics of fishing to know, but I will say that the oceans are the next frontier. Healthy ocean management is huge in this sector because of what I mentioned before. I mentioned the ability to grow kelp and sink it to the bottom of the ocean, and there was an agreement signed in Glasgow, or announced in Glasgow, where the U.S. joined a global consortium of other countries agreeing to create a sustainable seaside or a sustainable ocean economy, and explicitly designed to do things like this. I don't know what the carbon content is that comes from the seabed, and I don't know what alternative methods there are, but I can say there's that using the ocean as both taking better care of it so that it's not releasing, and also using it as a carbon sink. I mean, in addition to kelp farming, there's also whale carbon, which is this idea that if you can sink whale carcasses to the bottom of the ocean, when they basically you can have a pretty unmeasurable impact. I mean, there's so many things on the oceans that we're just now getting into. I did an episode with Steve Crooks, who is an expert on this area, and it does get fascinating because every alternative you look at does have complications and repercussions. I mean, this would obviously impact the livelihood of fishermen, but at the same time, there's already so much movement on the fishing front with catch shares and stuff like that, managing the seabed better. So I guess it's a long way of saying I don't know the answer, but it's intriguing. And yeah, sorry, Colin. I wish I had a better.
It just goes to show there's so many options here for things that we can do,
yeah.
which I have to say is something that the mainstream media doesn't seem to be very good at telling us, because they keep telling us that the world ended 14 years ago. And there've been at least 13 or 14 COPs since then.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty critical of mainstream coverage, although I think they underplayed. They focused on they overstated the certainty 20, 30 years ago. And then when the certainty was really certain, they understated it. And I think the problem I have with them right now is I think there's a lot of coverage on these gee whiz funky things. I've actually seen a lot of stories on kelp farming, even though it's really the next generation, but it's untested. It's just kind of cool and nifty. And there's a lot of coverage on Red Plus and nature-based solutions that are time-tested, have rigorous methodologies, and they're being attacked by a lot of media groups, I think only because they're transparent. Because if you open a project design document from any one of these, you can, they're all based on probabilities. You can always find something to pick apart. So it's a little bit frustrating to me to see the way mainstream coverage is still. I think they're still blowing it on the solutions front. Sorry. Oh, I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Okay.
I was thinking, actually, sorry, production are a bit slow this evening. The first thing I was thinking was there's also happens to be a minor argument going on in the street below me. Obviously, somebody's carbon offsets have gone slightly wrong in the course of downtown Valletta this evening. Certainly one of the things that struck me immediately was, well, the idea of sinking whale carcasses is brilliant. So what do? You put a big plastic bag inside them and inflate it with, oh no, hold on, plastic bags. Yeah, it's going to be tricky trying to get there. I mean, who on earth is going to be able to weave a very large grass basket that will hold sufficient weight of stuff that's biodegradable in order to hold it down there for a long time? Clearly there's research needed, but it's interesting nonetheless, the idea of kelp farming. And it's also absolutely fascinating to see, as Colin Howard's talking about, the possibilities for tidal energy, which are totally being not exploited. Yeah. But then again, I mean, we've just spent a month in the Caribbean, and frankly, the amount of solar power that's being harnessed out there struck me as pretty derisory, given the fact that it's, well, as sunny as anywhere gets on Earth, frankly. But thank you very much, Colin. Those are great questions and points altogether. Thank you for saying it was really interesting. I agree. It's fascinating listening to Steve. And Steve's going to be back in the new year for some of these interviews that we're going to have with the major carbon playing exchanges. I should also mention at the moment that not only are we here discussing the market view from COP26 with Steve Zwick, but also you can catch Steve's podcast, The Bionic Planet podcast, which is available from all the usual eco-friendly downloadable sources. No paper is used in the production, therefore it's remarkably low footprint altogether, just voice and digital recording altogether from Steve Zwick. Very, very interesting, the topics that he covers at all points in time. So we've got this carbon market at the moment, Steve. We've got lots happening in the scene, but at the same time, it strikes me, I mean, while there are certain catastrophists who are saying that the world is at 1 minute to midnight, which I'm not entirely convinced about, but given the amount of mitigation that's taken place already, we certainly are at a point where it looks to me like the automobile about 1893. I mean, it's barely discernible as the thing that the rest of the world will go on to drive for the next century and a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's very exciting right now. I disagree with you. I get pretty scared reading these IPCC reports. So I think we are pretty close, but at the same time, we're at an inflection point. I hate to keep hyping my show, but I had one with Bronson Griscom, who is a lead scientist at Conservation International now. I think he was at TNC before, but we talked about 30 years from now, if we get all these nature-based solutions up to scale, and we really manage this energy transition, we could have ecotopia, is the term he used. Ecotopia is out there, as he put it, or we could be completely screwed. So I think we're at this point where there's going to be a lot of change. There's going to be a lot of legacy a lot of legacy industries are going to suffer. A lot of companies that, this is again going back to the first Carney task force on climate transition risk, and companies that are caught flat-footed are going to be caught out. And there's a lot of evidence that most CEOs still think they can just buy offsets and be done, which they can't, or they can wait until 2040 and reduce, which they can't. I kind of went off topic there, but the industry is growing. The carbon offsetting is really a key driver of this, but it's really a larger economy that this sector is meant to produce. Did I answer that question, or did I go off on a tangent that?
I think you went off on an educational tangent, Steve. I think you managed to do both things at the one time. I mean, here we are. We're in a unique ecosystem, the Exchange Invest ecosystem, discussing our little niche community of markets the world over. We're looking at the whole market-based approach post COP26 with Steve Zwick, an expert in the field, who's also producer of his own excellent podcast, The Bionic Planet, which I thoroughly recommend as a great source of knowledge about the carbon markets and also the way the natural world can effectively heal itself, with a great deal of prompting from our good selves. So, Steve, we're into the last 10 minutes of the show. If you've got a question, ladies and gentlemen, start now, because by this stage of the hour, usually we're running with the question feeds are about 45 seconds to a minute behind. So I don't want you to miss out. If you've got a question to ask us, thank you very much to those who've been asking already. Steve, what do you think are the most important things we need to see to improve the environmental markets now in the next 5 years?
Let's say, I think we need transparency. We need comparability. I think we're getting what we need. We are getting. It's going to sound hokey, but what we needed was demand. That's what we didn't have before, and we have that. And I think we need education on the part of the public too, to understand what's legit and what isn't. There's an interesting dynamic that's playing up right now too, on both the nature-based side and the industrial side, which is supplies are really, we for years we were in a demand side market. It was mostly green-minded entrepreneurs who really wanted to go out and do good and make some money at the same time. So they created all of these projects, and a lot of them were floundering, and a lot of them were on the brink of going under just a couple of years ago. Now suddenly we've got all this demand, and it's flipped, and so there's a big surge towards towards going out and meeting that demand. And the question is, will they meet it with quality? And I think that's the thing that we need to do, is to ensure, especially with land use, because land use is so complicated. We need to make sure that we're getting verified, validated afforestation, reforestation projects, and not just playing some Yahoo to go plant a few trees. So that we need to make sure that people understand what the difference is between a good offset, a good credit, and one that isn't going to do anything.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously, so therefore standards, transparency, liquidity, accessibility. Well, hold on a second. Liquidity, accessibility, transparency. Somebody wrote a book about that 20 odd years ago, whatever that might have been. The principles of what we need are the same as we need in all known markets. Yeah. And we're talking about a 500% increase being suggested by the Slovenian academic. That almost seems at the conservative end of the potential of what's there, because you're talking about the product base firing all over the place. I was really interested, just give us a minute or two, a high level on some of these fascinating indigenous projects you were talking about in relation to forestry amongst certain tribes and other groupings. I mean, where in the world are they, and what are some of them trying to do?
Oh, they're all over the place. There's, in the United States, there's a tribe called the Yurok people, who went out and they did afforestation, reforestation, and improved forest management, which is where you take an area of forest that has not been managed well and manage it better, manage it more sustainably, and get credit for the extra carbon. And then they used the money from that to go and expand. They bought back some of their traditional tribal lands. There are groups in Kenya. There are aggregated small farmers, smallholder farmers in Kenya who are implementing agroforestry. And what they're doing is by planting trees in among their crops, they're improving their yields. They're getting credit for the carbon that they sequester in the soil. And they're also using the silage to feed their cows, so they get more milk per burp, because cows, every time they burp, they emit methane. So they're not reducing the amount of methane that the cows are emitting, but they're increasing the amount of milk they get per burp, and now they're adding new feed in that's made from garlic and orange peels and seaweed and stuff, and reduces the burp. So that's another one. There are others. There's another group in Kenya, or no, there's a group in boy, there's so many. There are tribes in the Amazon who are doing Red Plus projects, where what they're doing is, Red Plus is you go out and you identify threats to the forest, and you quantify it using approved methodology. So this is based on the activities we see. This forest is high risk of danger, but if we can implement these methods, we can save it. And a lot of tribes are embracing Red Plus. And a lot of times what they're doing is using the money to not only protect the forest, but to create new alternative lifestyles. It's
So what they're creating alternative lifestyles, they're creating new products, and they're also finding other ways to actually improve what they've already got, because you're making the key point about methane. And interestingly, I hear that once again, we're talking about seaweed. So it seems to me that kelp is suddenly the mega super product of the age, as it seems to solve pretty much everything. Soon it'll be, I don't know, they'll be trying to bring it into the NBA under some sort of a scholarship. That's a fascinating, I mean, it is really, really interesting. I'm not trying to be overly facetious. I'm just trying to bring the points to life, because it's so interesting. So therefore, Steve, you're going to put an E on this thing, or possibly a carbon-centric approach. But as we ask everybody at the end of the show, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
You mean within this sector, or
anywhere in the sector is good?
Yeah, let's see. Where does it go next? Wow, I wish I'd prepped for that one. It could go in so many different directions. On nature-based solutions, I think it's going to go into what I just talked about. It's going to go into it's going to go into cooperating with indigenous people. Indigenous people control so much of the world's forests, and they really do have a history of good land management, and they are under threat. And I think that we're going to see there's a new movement towards market-based mechanisms that aren't off. There's a complication in dealing with indigenous people, which is to get credit to do a Red Plus project. You have to show that the forest is under threat, and because indigenous people are protecting these areas, they often don't qualify, but they're starving to protect these areas. So there's a new move towards paying them to maintain the forest based on what they call indigenous life plans, which have been evolving over decades. And this is an idea that's been around for a while, but there was never a corporate appetite, and there was never a way to quantify the impact. One of the things that I saw in Glasgow is there are new technologies that can make it possible to verify the biodiversity impacts, the water impacts, using sensors that pick up DNA in the air and the soil and the water. You can see what kind of species are on this land, as well as what kind of carbon is there. And these kind of ecological benefits, it kind of goes to the old payments for ecosystem services thing, but they're people going beyond philanthropy and getting corporations to somehow support this, as a way of offsetting past impacts, or winning consumer approval, or conversely also just improving their supply chain management, which is, we didn't even touch on that here, but there's a whole supply chain movement that is tangential to the carbon movement, and they kind of reinforce each other.
Well, it's that catastrophe of, 50% of tomatoes don't manage to get to market in Egypt. for example. Right. And I mean, that's a pretty efficient market by comparison with the huge others. So we've got this incredible supply chain revolution. We've got the huge opportunity for the products themselves. We've got an amazing opportunity within indigenous people. And you've been talking about those across, good grief, it took you 2 minutes to cover 3 different continents there in one fell swoop, whether it was the indigenous North Americans, people who were in the rainforest, and also looking at all sorts of projects that were happening in Africa. So essentially, there's just one unbelievably huge opportunity here at the moment, as well as the fact that we have an incredible need for these particular products to grow and to make ourselves more efficient. We need more buy-in from the corporate sector. It's all based around a science, a philosophy, stuff that dates all the way back to William Nordhaus and also Freeman Dyson in the 1970s with their groundbreaking original papers way before the 26 conferences of COP. And you discussed how we got all the way towards, well, places like Poland, and you were talking about Katowice, which I'll pronounce hopefully slightly better for the sake of our Polish producer this evening, rather than Katowice, which sounded a bit to me like somewhere in Hawaii, Steve. I've got to say, we might have to work on that in the future, your Polish. But it's so interesting looking also back and thinking about where we were in the 1990s, NOx and SOx and acid rain. Who talks about acid rain these days? And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I happen to be an optimist in this thing, because notwithstanding the fact that we need to take action, nonetheless, we essentially managed to kill acid rain. And that was a good thing. It was long overdue, but certainly the NOx, SOx, acid rain thing that was being talked about 20 odd years ago is something that's disappeared. You've given us a great idea of everything through a multiplicity of different acronyms. ITMOs was one of my new ones for this evening. We've tried to look at this idea of the global carbon price. And that's going to be something we're going to carry on this debate about all the way into the first quarter of next year, ladies and gentlemen. We've already got the Intercontinental Exchange coming to talk about their products. Next week, we're going to have Capital Markets from Brussels with Love, with Rosa Armesto Playa. She is the Deputy Director General of FESE, the Federation of European Securities Exchanges. It's going to be very interesting to hear her views, which I think are going to contrast somewhat from Jake Pugh, who was one of the very early guests on our show, and of course, an MEP for a period of time before Brexit. It only remains for me to say, ladies and gentlemen, Steve Zwick, this has been a fascinating show. We're really looking forward to having you back in the new year so that we can have these three-way discussions with the Intercontinental Exchange, with the Carbon Exchange, with also hopefully Expansive and other parties in the area of carbon markets and those who are trying to make an environmental difference. Thank you very much to all those who contributed this evening. Simon Huckle, Colin Howard, Bata Young, Woman on It. We had an anonymous question from the IPO-VID community as well. Steve Zwick, thank you very much for watching. My name is Patrick L. Young. I also happen to be Executive Director of Valerium. So in that case, I wish you all another great week in life, blockchain, and markets. Thanks for watching.